Welcome to the Natural Healing Show. Keep it natural with the Natural Healing Show.
Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Wibe Wagemans. Wibe Wagemans is the author of the new book, Cortisol, the Master Hormone. And you can find out more about Wibe Wagemans and his wonderful work at his website, masterhormone.com. Welcome, Wibe Wagemans.
Thanks, Catherine, for having me.
All right. So first of all, let's talk our basics with our audience. What exactly is cortisol?
It's a hormone. What a hormone does is signaling between various organs. So it's really transmitting information from one to the next and telling them what to do. And in the case of cortisol, it actually is produced by the adrenal gland, which is sitting on top of our kidneys, and it receives signals from the pituitary gland, which is receiving signals from the hypothalamus, which is a very critical part of our brain. And what cortisol does is it's over millions of years, pretty much all mammals have it. It's setting us up for what we know as the fight or flight, but actually we need to add to that freeze or fawn. Fawn is that you try to please somebody who's putting a lot of pressure on you, and freeze, as you can imagine, if that's happening a lot with mental health, where instead of fighting or fleeing, which we sometimes cannot even physically do, we start to freeze and we start to internalize all these stressors. So that is, so in many cases, cortisol helps us to survive, and this is how it has evolved and helping us and all our mammal friends to survive every day, in combination with adrenaline. But over time, with our current society, the estimate is that between 60 and 90% of the adult population in the US, for example, is suffering from elevated cortisol levels. And that is a problem because it wreaks havoc on every single biological process in our bodies. And just to give you an idea how devastating the effect is, you type in any disease at all in Google Scholar, and you will find that somebody has found a correlation between cortisol, if not a correlation, sometimes even the cause or the effect of that disease with cortisol. And so it really damages everything in your body, metabolism, sex organs, all the way to your brain.
Wonderful information, and couple comments. I've now taught yoga for 27 years. At age 63, I still teach 8 yoga classes a week. I refer to that as my mental health program. And I remember when I was studying one of my 6 200-hour yoga teacher trainings, and we had to memorize a long list of health problems that were caused by stress. And as you mentioned, it's pretty much everything. If you have an illness or a disease, more than likely there is a cortisol factor in why you are as sick as you are. And one of my 10 books is called Unlimited Energy Now. And it's all about how to rebuild your personal energy, because so many people in our culture have been so stressed for so long that they're energetically depleted. Now, Wibe Wagemans, you and I were joking before we got on the air, because you're in Silicon Valley, you're a CEO, a serial entrepreneur, and a pioneer in the mobile and AI technology industry. So we were joking, you don't know anything about stress. Tell us about your background and how you came to work with Pardine.
Yep. Sure. Yeah. So my background is indeed. So I'm Dutch. Moved around the world a bit. Worked for big companies. Think of Gillette in Tokyo. Worked for. Sorry, that was Canon in Tokyo. Gillette in Europe. Then Nokia took me all over the world. Landed in the Valley, and I really fell in love and have been addicted to Silicon Valley and innovation since. You wouldn't expect me to go into wellness and biotech and health, which is what we're doing right now, deep medical spaces. But these people keep telling me that it really required an external team to break through some of the barriers that they were facing, and I'll explain to you what that means in a sec. How I got to this is a family member of mine. Seeing a psychiatrist, and I asked a psychiatrist a very simple question: how do you quantify stress? And he said, we asked the patient how they feel. And I said, that's great. Do you have any quantifier? And he said, no, this is how we've been doing it for 150 years. We asked the patient how they feel. So it didn't sit well with me. I called up a friend of mine who's an internist, and he said, well, there's a gold standard for stress as a biomarker, and it's called cortisol. But you know it as a stress marker, but that's only 3% of what cortisol does. And I said, okay, great. If that's so important, and I don't know anything about it, then why the heck are you guys in the medical field not testing this? And he said it's almost impossible to test. Just to give you a couple of examples, you need to have 5 measurements on day 1. The first one being tested at wake up time. So the moment you jump into your car, you're sitting in traffic and you're entering the doctor's office for a blood sample or saliva, you already have the wrong cortisol measurement. On top of that, what doctors and labs usually do, and even hospitals, is they test you once. And you can compare this to me, I would take your pulse right now, Catherine, and I would measure your heartbeat for 1 second, and I would try to diagnose whether you have a cardiovascular disease or not. So it's almost impossible. So what you need to do is 2 things. One is you need to have those 5 measurements, and most doctors have never learned this in med school. The second one is it needs the right time points in the day so that you can have that diurnal curve. So you really know what's going on with the individual. And it doesn't have to be a disease, right? If we have it elevated, I'll show you what actually happens to our body. And it's pretty devastating to the majority of us. The other part is you really want to do this at home, unless you're tied to a hospital bed 24/7. Who's going to take those measurements at the right time? So the bottleneck really was, we've known, by the way, about cortisol and its devastating effects for decades. There's over 1.5 million peer-reviewed studies out there. So I didn't have to do a single clinical study. All I needed to do was read what was there already. And it turns out that the bottleneck is the lab test. So what if, instead of having your doctor run a test, whether it's saliva or blood or urine, send it to a lab, what if you would have that lab scanner, which is required? It's like a 10,000, £10,000 dollar device that's sitting in a lab or university or hospital. What if you could replicate that on your mobile phone and use your mobile phone as an AI, a computer vision device, and have that build the intelligence in there? So from a hardware perspective, it was actually possible. And that's how we got on this journey. So we reverse engineered it, and we got the proof of concept. We got to about already 4% off of lab readings last year, and the only way is up.
Okay, now Wibe Wagemans, in my 29 years full-time experience in natural healing, for decades, what I have recommended people to do when they want to test their cortisol function is to do an adrenal function test. And there's lots of companies that do this. And it's usually a saliva test. And you, as you say, you do these tests at home, you order a test kit, you spit into the vials, usually 8 a.m. noon, around 4 p.m., and then usually about 10 p.m. And then from those results, then the labs will give you an idea of what is your cortisol curve. And as you said, 60 to 90% of people in Western society tend to have elevated cortisol. In addition to that, there are people who've been so stressed for so long that their cortisol levels are depleted. And based on that cortisol curve, you can make specific recommendations for people in natural healing about what do you need to do to become a healthier person. Now, again, before you and I were speaking, I was like, wait, we need to save this for our audience. You said that in your professional opinion, adrenal burnout doesn't exist. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so there's terms that have been floating around and are still being used by some physicians out there today, which have been caught up in science years and years ago. And some of them we used to use terms like adrenal fatigue, and there is no such thing as adrenal fatigue. Your adrenals don't get tired. It's really like you accurately portrayed actually how it works. So what happens is if you're stressed over time, your cortisol levels tend to elevate, and then when you go to an extreme, your body basically it's called the HPA axis, which are the three organs that I just explained before. So hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals. That's called the HPA axis. That comes from the brain. Your brain is basically telling you, I've put so much cortisol in your body to protect you that now I'm going to, really protect your body and lower your cortisol levels. So basically the HPA axis is telling your adrenals to lower the production. So it's nothing to do with the adrenals being fatigued or anything.
Okay, great information. Now, what is Pardim? And how does your company Pardim plan to test adrenal function in the future? Because this is really the wave of the future.
Yeah, a couple of things. So first of all, yes, there are labs out there that you can send your results to, and some of them are based on saliva, which is great because saliva is actually a more accurate measurement than in blood, in serum. Because you want the unbound cortisol. But still, to measure it at the right time of day is absolutely critical. You can totally, by even being half an hour off, you can get the wrong information. So just saying, hey, measure it at 8 o'clock doesn't mean anything. If you wake up at 7 or 7:30, it makes a heck of a difference. So it really needs to be guided properly. And secondly, why wait? Right? Why wait for days or weeks until you have the results? If you can get the result at home on your mobile phone in a matter of minutes. So that's what we do. So we have the test strip, which looks very similar to a COVID test or a pregnancy test. And in our case, the second line always appears. It's a matter of the light intensity. So our computer vision is reading the exact score. So let's say 3.9 nanograms. Now, once you've done those 5 tests, we have a very accurate picture of your cortisol levels and what's going on. And based on that, we look at your goal. Your goal could be weight loss, or I want to get pregnant, or I have menopausal symptoms that I need to get rid of or at least lower. I'm an Olympic athlete and I need to know my training plan today. Cortisol is the number one biomarker for all the above. It goes on. If you want to live longer, healthier, it's the number one cause of the shortening of telomeres, and telomeres happen to be the reason why our cells die. Kind of important if you want to live longer. The same with, and this is for the UK listeners, they might have heard of the Whitehall studies, one of the best medical studies ever done, because it's gone on for decades. It's longitudinal, double blind, paid by the government, so no conflict of interest. And turns out that the number one cause of early death in cardiovascular disease, which turns out our number one cause of death in the modern countries, number one cause of early death is not smoking. It's not overweight. It's not diabetes. It was very clear that number one in the longitudinal study was cortisol.
Fabulous information. Now let's go back to my question. What is Pardiem? Is this a company you created?
Yeah, we're a startup in Silicon Valley. We're a year and a half old, and we have the breakthrough that we can test biomarkers like cortisol and others at home. And we have built the technology, and that's the first part. The second part is, like we're talking right now, is getting the information out of how important it is to measure biomarkers like cortisol, estrogen, testosterone, vitamin D, and so forth. And then we have kind of a recommendation engine in the mobile app where, based on your scores and your goal, we help you, sorting out your symptoms.
So let's explain for our audience in a real practical terms, how does this work? Like if I download the Pardiem app, how would I personally go about testing my cortisol?
Right. So we are not in the market yet. So we have according to a biochemist, we had a breakthrough in the technology that is on the level of the Holy Grail in biotech. So to have accomplished this in a year and a half is we're already very proud of that. But unfortunately, we're not ready for consumer testing yet. But the way it works is very simple. So you get the test strips, and your saliva goes in there, similar to a COVID test. It flows for 2 minutes. You look at the lines, you snap a picture with your iPhone or Android, and immediately you'll get the cortisol reading accurately. So lab level accuracy. Once we have those 5 readings, we are going to tell you, what you could be working on, and we need your input as well. Like we discussed, it could be that you want to sleep better, or you want to solve issues with your skin or immune. Maybe some you have some compromised diseases that you want to you think. Look, it's first of all, it's validation, right? You want to know, is it cortisol or is it something else? In many cases, it is cortisol. If not the number one cause, it could be a contributing factor. So lots of folks will be according to professors that we're working with, millions of people will want to test this in the next few years.
This is super exciting information. And with that, let's take a break to listen to a commercial sponsor here at UK Health Radio. And we'll be right back with Wibe Wagemans, author of Cortisol, the Master Hormone.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
So Wibe Wagemans, I really appreciate what you're doing, because as a medical intuitive healer, I'm always explaining to people how stress affects their various illnesses and what they can do about it. And in this day and age, many people in the technology field have been involved in the development of personal apps that help you measure things like your heart rate variability and so on, that help you monitor your personal health. And I appreciate also that you wrote your book, Cortisol, the Master Hormone. What do people not know about cortisol?
So they think it's just stress, and sometimes, and then let me be very clear, stress is helpful. Stress, we should embrace it. Stress, we should, and we actually are training you to master your stress. But the problems arise, obviously, that when the stress keeps getting elevated. And, even alpha males on Wall Street, they've had tests where they're also proud, like, I'm so stressed, I sleep so little. it turns out the return on investments, there have been very good studies done where the return on investment of cortisol elevated individuals, the ROI was much lower than of their counterparts that who managed and balanced their cortisol levels. So it's detrimental in many ways, even for alpha males, even for professional Olympic athletes who we have been testing as well. So they don't know that this is the number one biomarker. Way in the sports science, it's taken way more seriously than HRV that you just talked about, heart rate variability, for the simple reason that HRV is not correlated with cortisol. It's correlated mostly with your breathing rhythm, which is not unimportant, but you want a variable that is giving you a good idea of what your readiness, both mental and physical, is, and also over time to be a stable indicator of what's going on in your body. I'll give you another example of some really people that we look up to. Naomi Osaka last year, she took a couple of months off for mental health reasons. And we spoke to our scientific advisory board, and they said, without testing her, that 99% probability it was a cortisol problem. The other example is Naomi, and Simone Biles at the Olympics. She was suffering from what they call in gymnastics the twisties, which means that the signaling in muscle memory, basically, you're losing your automatisms in performing tasks. That's these extremely hard tasks that gymnasts do. So she jumped off of a couple of events, and some of them, some people hailed her for that courage. Others lambasted her for not being strong enough mentally. But she I think did an amazing job for raising awareness for mental health, even for super fit athletes like that. Again, our scientific advisory board said 99% likely that the twisties were caused by her cortisol levels. So that is just a fraction, and we've discussed other things. Sleep, you could take all the melatonin pills in the world. You will not solve your sleep problems if you do not balance your cortisol levels. You will never lose weight long term. It's physiologically impossible to lose weight if you do not balance your cortisol levels. And as we know now in pre-diabetes and diabetes, that insulin is very important. So I asked a question to top scientists, and I said, "Well, do you agree that insulin, is the biomarker for pre-diabetes and diabetes?" And they said, yes, it's critical. And you usually measure it at home with the glucose meter, or at your doctor's office with a marker called HbA1c. And I said, okay, so what would you say is cortisol the number 2 biomarker for pre-diabetes and diabetes, which is, by the way, 70% of adults of most Western countries are suffering from either pre-diabetes or diabetes. And they said, well, actually, we disagree. We think it should be at least on the same level as insulin. So that shows you the importance of cortisol in our whole metabolic syndrome. That if you do not manage your cortisol, it runs amok, and you get into this corner, this vicious cycle where both your insulin is out of whack and you have insulin resistance to some level, and you have elevated cortisol levels. Or like you said earlier, when you go to a point where you've damaged your body so much, it goes into defending your body, so your cortisol levels drop, which is even harder to come back from. And that happens. Your question was, what do we not know about cortisol? Well, guess what? They just found that the only biomarker for long COVID is cortisol. The morning cortisol levels are 50% lower. This is coming from the immunology group at Yale. It was such an amazing finding that they pre-published it. So it hasn't been peer reviewed yet, but it reached a lot of big media because the results were not just, oh, your cortisol is off by 5% or 10%. No, cortisol levels were off by 50% in the morning. So it is really crucial for symptoms like long COVID, for depression, to measure your cortisol levels.
So Wibe Wagemans, you bring up several really super important points. One is that your adrenal glands that secrete the cortisol are just being governed by your brain, because your brain is, of course, the most important organ. And your hypothalamus, you can think of it like the control tower at the airport, is telling your pituitary what to do, and then the pituitary is telling what the adrenals what to do. And one of the things that we know, the scientific research, is that depression, 2 of my books are about how to heal depression without drugs, is a dysregulation of this HPA axis. So,
that's correct.
So the stress response in our brain affects, as you say, absolutely everything. And another thing, I remember years ago studying with an Olympic strength coach, and he said that you carry fat in your body based on specific hormone imbalances. And when you hold fat around your belly button area, that belly fat that a lot of people have trouble getting rid of, that is a sign of cortisol imbalance, right?
That's for sure. That's for sure. It goes. I would even go further. You specifically, you obviously have this with male. Lots of fat around the fat tissue. There's fat cells that basically expand around the organs, which we call visceral adipose tissue. And you see it specifically with women entering perimenopause or menopause after age of 45, particularly, where fat cells might stay the same or get depleted around the hip area, and fat starts accumulating around, like you said, the belly button or the organs. Now, the fat in itself would, we know the pros and cons of that, but what is actually happening is fascinating. The fat cells around your organs become cortisol glands. So when you have, like you said, cortisol imbalances, the elevated cortisol levels are stored by the liver in those fat cells around your organs by an enzyme called 11-beta HSD2. The problem with that is, when you, whether you're a man or a woman, you have that excess fat. And it could be a little, some people call it skinny fat even, where they might have that type of tissue. Problem is, when we get stressed, even when we go on a diet, let's take an example. I'm on a keto diet, I'm fasting for 8 hours. Guess what? You think you're healthy, you think you are doing an amazing job. You are stuck in this corner, in this vicious cycle, because your cortisol that is stored in your fat cells now see that there's a drop of glucose in your blood. What cortisol does is making sure that the glucose in your blood is at the proper level. So liver pulls out, with the help of that enzyme, is pulling out the stored cortisol, which is called cortisone, and is pushing glucose into the bloodstream as a result. Your glucose spikes, your insulin spikes, and the whole cycle begins, and you start craving your processed carbs again. And if you don't give into it, your cortisol will wreak havoc around your body. And because of the increased insulin levels, you also see a lot of effects on your cardiovascular health, your brain health, and your immune system.
And Wibe Wagemans, you just gave a really excellent example about why, when people are wanting to lose weight, they have to deal with their stress. Otherwise, nothing happens.
That's right.
Right. And I've had so many clients come to me. It's like, Catherine, I'm not losing weight. Why is that? Well, part of it is they're too stressed, and they may be engaging in health practices such as starving that actually elevate your cortisol levels.
That's correct.
Now, with that, let's take another break to listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio, and we'll be right back with Wibe Wagemans, author of Cortisol, the Master Hormone.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. station that makes you feel good.
So Wibe Wagemans, in my 29 years and of experience in natural healing, one of the people who's been most influential to me in understanding cortisol has been Dr. Diana Schwartzbein, medical doctor, endocrinologist. And Dr. Schwartzbein talks about what she calls major hormones, meaning there's a lot of them, and minor hormones. And the way I like to explain it to my clients, if you're having problems with your female hormones, well, you can't get those balanced and you get your major hormones balanced. What are your major hormones? Cortisol, adrenaline, and insulin. What is the relationship, in your professional opinion, between adrenaline and cortisol? And for our audience, and I apologize for the double question, what is the difference between adrenaline and cortisol?
Yes, for sure. First, I would argue that it's more important to look at, rather than major and minor hormones, I would look at upstream and downstream. Because you might have, like, I'll give you one example. A lot of women don't know that they have 10 times more testosterone levels, higher testosterone levels than estrogen levels. So it's not so much the major versus the minor. It's more of what is at the top of the food chain deciding everything else, and that is cortisol. And the second one I would mention is actually not insulin. It's actually thyroid. So it's really cortisol, thyroid, and then you go to insulin, and then you have, sex hormones are inhibited, as we just discussed, are inhibited. Both testosterone, DHEA, estrogen, progesterone are inhibited by cortisol if it's elevated, which basically means, and I'll go into that in a little bit, that a 20% elevation of cortisol would render any woman infertile. So that is a major finding that people don't realize. If they don't understand why they can't get pregnant, well, guess what? You might want to validate your cortisol levels. Back to your question on the difference between cortisol and adrenaline. It's fairly straightforward. Both come from the adrenal gland, which is this little organ on top of your kidney. And your adrenaline, or epinephrine, as we call it, is being released immediately in a split second. The half-time value is 12 minutes, so it disappears from your body relatively quickly. But as you might know, adrenaline might give you this if you have ever been in an accident or something. I hope not, but you might have seen this release where, when the adrenaline goes out of your body, you might start shaking or shivering, or this amazing effect that it has. Because what adrenaline does, it pushes all the glucose that's stored into your bloodstream to have every cell in your body wake up and survive, to fight for your survival. That's adrenaline. The cortisol kicks in a little bit later, and the half-time value is 66 minutes. Problem is, if it comes down after those 66 minutes, great, right? It has come to great benefit, doing a test at the university, running a race, being amazing at work, giving a presentation for a large group of people. But guess what? When it stays elevated by all kinds of dopamine hits, poor nutrition, stressful situations, social media, then we run into trouble. So that's really the key difference between adrenaline and cortisol, that cortisol elevation over time is the number one culprit.
So what you're saying is, when we're stressed, your adrenaline kicks in first and cortisol kicks in second.
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, Wibe Wagemans, here you are. You're the author of this book, Cortisol, the Master Hormone, but also a CEO and a serial entrepreneur and a pioneer in mobile and AI technology. Here we are at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. How do you manage your stress? What do you do?
I try to combine a couple of things. So number one, I try, and it doesn't always work, but I try to embrace my stress. so that I own it and it's not running me. That's number one. The second one is really the biggest one, I would say, is nutrition. So I've gone mostly to a strict low carb diet. I know there's various definitions of keto, but I tend to limit my my carb intake, and also as few processed carbs as possible. I not only that, I try to limit my insulin peaks to a few a day, so no snacking. I skip breakfast to have a prolonged fasting period and reset my my receptors of both insulin and other biomarkers. And once a quarter, and I've been doing that now for 6-7 years, once a quarter, I do a 5-day water fast. So just water, green tea, nothing else. The first time I did it was really hard, and my body's gotten used to it now. So I get to what they call a starvation ketosis level, which is 3.0 milligram. I get to that right now in like 24, 36 hours, depending on my glycogen storage. So that is really helping me. I don't do it to, some people do it to prevent cancer or lose weight or all the above, whatever your goal is. I support all of the above, but I do it to reset my body and mind. And I see tremendous benefits, both in focus, growth hormones, immune systems. Then I go to hormetic stressors, the last category. It's exercise where I stress my body on purpose because I know my cortisol gets elevated during the exercise, and it could be like I swim regularly in water which is like 8-9 degrees right now in this part of the season. I think it's around 48 Fahrenheit, and that obviously increases your adrenaline and your cortisol. But I've read the studies that it actually brings your cortisol down after a couple of hours, then lower than where it would have been. You sleep very well as well, and the endorphins start flying around your body for a few hours afterwards. So I find that very helpful. Combine it sometimes with the sauna. So that's what I do. And then among your listeners, if you have women in so that's me as a man in middle age. But I would say for cortisol specifically for women who want to get pregnant, women in menopause, I would really, really focus on balancing your cortisol levels and see if it helps you with your symptoms. Because what we've learned from talking to the top, and as you'll see, read in the book, we've spoken to the top scientists in the world, and unequivocally, it comes out cortisol is the number one cause of infertility and menopausal symptoms.
I agree with you 100%. And I really appreciate also your personal testimony of swimming in freezing water, not eating, fasting for 5 days at a time. And as a medical intuitive healer, my comment is that's what works for you, but I wouldn't venture to recommend some of those approaches for absolutely everyone. Because
for sure.
And you would agree with that as well, I'm sure.
Absolutely, and let's not forget, male and female bodies and minds are totally different, and especially, I made the example of menopausal women. You really want to be careful in putting too much stress on your body by, for example, you cannot put them on a similar fasting plan as a younger person. You are increasing cortisol levels, and you might make it worse. So you have to be really careful in what you do, both with nutrition and fasting.
Yeah, and my book, Unlimited Energy Now, is about how to restore your energy after being stressed for long periods of time, which is, I wrote the book because exhaustion is probably the number one side effect or symptom that my clients come to me to talk about. Now, will you share for our audience, what are the 3 most important takeaways that you want people to learn from the book you wrote, Cortisol, the Master Hormone?
I would say, number one, validate whether cortisol is affecting you. whether it's affecting your weight, your depression, your PTSD, your postpartum depression, it goes to pretty much everything we've discussed, cardiovascular health. It goes into sex drive, erectile dysfunction. I mean, it's just insane if you dive into the data. So really invite you to go. The book only has so many pages, and there's over a million studies, as I mentioned, peer reviewed. So that's number one: is it educate yourself on cortisol, validate it. That's number two, and then number three, use that to live a better life and be more healthier, both physically and mentally. Because if there's one thing I learned, it's that cortisol is the best biomarker we have to look into our brain. Of everything we know, it's the mirror, it's the window into our brain. It really is. And so from that perspective, knowing your cortisol levels is super helpful.
And well, one of the things that we know, you said cortisol is the number one biomarker way to look into what's happening in your brain. One of the things we know is that cortisol actually destroys brain cells.
Correct.
So if someone is wanting to protect their brain over time, what sort of strategies from a natural health perspective do you recommend to protect your brain against the effects of stress?
Yeah, so the steps we lay out in the book is one is embrace. So really don't see it just as a negative. Cortisol is there to help us if you control it properly. Number one. Number two is nutrition that we talked about. Yes, the combination of elevated cortisol levels and insulin resistance is eventually, right, not instantly, but over time. You can almost put a stopwatch like 10, 20, 30 years. Look at cardiovascular disease, look at Alzheimer's, look at all that. I invite every medical discipline, from psychiatrists to psychologists to endocrinologists to gynecologist and nephrologist. You go through the whole spectrum. I invite them to go through every chapter of the book because they usually know what cortisol does in their lane. Move over one lane, they don't know that it's the number one cause of infertility. They don't know if it's the number one. There's a clear causal effect and actually gradation of cortisol levels and levels of depression. And I think in the future, we've spoken to a professor in psychiatry on that in the future, if we have more data points, it's very likely that we can build an early warning system based on your cortisol levels and levels of depression, and even might prevent burnout. Because today there is no commonly agreed term definition of burnout in the medical field. I'm just a messenger. The professors we've spoken to are basically saying, with the work that we're doing by allowing cortisol tests being taken by millions of people, very likely that we can define quantitatively what burnout means in levels of cortisol.
And I so appreciate the important work you're doing explaining the relationship between cortisol and depression, because so many of my clients, I say to them, you're not crazy, you're just exhausted. And when we're depleted, when we're energetically depleted, we do feel depressed. And a lot of the depression is related to the constant pressure that people are putting on themselves. So Wibe Wagemans, what is the relationship between cortisol and inflammation? When I do my medical intuitive readings, one of the things that I look at is inflammation. And you can be inflamed. I explained inflammation's like fire in the body. I can throw a match on the ground and burn the entire house down. So can you explain that for our audience?
Yeah, it's funny that you ask. It's a bit complex. It took me a while to wrap my head around it. So a lot of people know that you use cortisone shots, right, to fight inflammation sometimes. Well, guess what? You're bypassing your HPA axis, and it's a short-term impact on that particular inflammatory spot, and it might even solve it. The problem is that, again, the moment you have elevated cortisol levels, it will do the opposite. It will drive inflammation. It will unbalance your gut and all the billions of bacteria we have there. So it's on one hand, it's the only weapon our human body has to fight autoimmune diseases. It's cortisol. But as we discussed at length, if it's elevated, it will destroy and inflame your body further. And inflammation, whether it's stress or through nutrition or you name it, it will make that worse. And a combination between insulin and cortisol is detrimental when it comes to cardiovascular diseases, which is all about, as you know, it's all about inflammation.
Yeah. So inflammation, again, it causes heart disease. It causes hardening of the arteries and causes all kinds of GI problems. Any illness ending in itis, arthritis, colitis is a result of inflammation. And you have to understand that just being stressed will drive up your inflammation. So cortisol alone will drive up your inflammation.
Yep.
You mentioned that cortisol is the only tool against autoimmune disease that our body has. Can you explain more about that for our audience?
Yeah, it's again, it's about overexposure, or it could even have come from one example. I was stunned when I heard this by a professor in endocrinology. She told me that the cortisol levels of your mother or even your grandmother could live on and have effect on your body and mind. So we're not crazy. This is not some voodoo story. This has been researched and documented very well, where they tested women in the hunger winter in Europe, 44, 45. The elevated cortisol levels, when the cortisol levels are so high, they cannot be filtered out by an enzyme in the placenta anymore. So they flow over into the blood of the fetus, do damage, usually cause a premature birth, and even a premature birth of 2 weeks causes additional cortisol increases in the baby. And the reason is, number one, in an incubator, the baby is staying fewer hours with the mother in the crucial first few days, which increases cortisol. The other piece that has been very well studied is that the immune system is not fully developed if it's not delivered to the baby is not delivered to term, and as a result, cortisol has to make up for that inflammation or immunocompromised situation. It could be just a few percent. That in itself has been proven to limit growth. So the height of the adult might be 2 centimeters up to an inch lower than what it would have been without the cortisol. Now, what is even more stunning is that this professor, this is Sarah Berger, whom we also quote in the book, was saying that when a mother delivers a daughter, that daughter already has the eggs inside her of her daughter. So you are looking at 2 generations of cascading cortisol levels potentially. But this is one example. So back to your question, one thing it could be, hey, you have an allergy. It might have just come from being in a too clean environment sometimes. But sometimes it could be, might not be epigenetic or genetic. It might just be elevated cortisol levels that carry over 1 or 2 generations. So this is critical to understand. And the other point I want to make is if you care about your sex hormones, for example, let's say estrogen for women or testosterone for men, then the first thing to look at is actually not measure your estrogen or your testosterone levels. The first thing to look at is your cortisol levels, because they will deplete your estrogen. They will deplete it's an inhibitor. So they will deplete your testosterone levels.
This is absolutely fabulous information. And I'm sure we could go on. Wibe Wagemans, any final thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, I'd welcome Welcome to. There's a lot more to be learned, right? There's a lot of more studies to be done. We invite scientists all over the world to engage in that. To your listeners, I would say, educate yourself, and if you're interested in participating in the first test next year, please sign up for our waitlist on paradigm.com.
On paradigm.com. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today has been Wibe Wagemans, CEO, serial entrepreneur, and author of Cortisol, the Master Hormone. And you can find out more about Wibe Wagemans and his wonderful work at his website, masterhormone.com. And remember, when you manage your stress, you begin to heal yourself naturally. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Natural Healing